I don't know if any of you remember, but back in 2007, there was a student revolt in Freiburg. I happened to be a visiting professor at the time. This revolt, so to speak, was unique in that the students held staff hostage inside the buildings. This went on for 2 full weeks. We had no discomfort really, and we occupied ourselves in interdisciplinary discussions. Out of one of those arose something the 3 of us vowed never to talk about for the rest of our lives. For our careers' sakes, if nothing else. I don't easily break a vow. However, it's been 10 years, and the more I think about it, the more I think it should be known. A friend of mine, a scientist, was talking at length about how important a discovery the Higgs boson was. I believe I started his monologue because I stated that the Large Hadron Collider still frightened me. Being a skeptic, I was content to just listen to him. My other friend, a sociologist, was not. I think it was mostly out of mischief that he began his critique. But it's what led to all that happened. He said the LHC was the most expensive backpatter ever created, and a real triumph to the ego of scientists. He waited for the shock to set in, then explained. Upon what principles are the machines that corroborate scientific theories designed? The principles of science, of course. They are constructed, like the collider, to test a particular notion, the parameters of which are already pre-decided and pre-coded into the machine. The machine then tells the scientists exactly what they built it to say, and then they say, it's remarkable. The machine finally confirmed their imaginary particle is real. If the machine says anything unexpected, it just needs to be calibrated. The scientist took the idea personally and said he couldn't explain how wrong that is any more than he could explain to someone why you can't give birth to your own mother. Either you grasp the basic concepts in logic, or you don't. We all start with sensory receptors that are impinged upon physical reality. We built up this whole edifice of science from the ability to explain and predict these raw impingements. The fact that you can go home and watch TV is proof the science works. The sociologist had a ready response for this too. These sensory organs developed through a process of natural selection, right? The scientist agreed. Then you understand that natural selection has nothing to do with the truth and everything to do with survival. It's as reasonable to think we survive by being constantly deceived as to believe we survive by knowing reality as it is. Maybe we were naturally selected to detect the world all wrong. I saw they were soon going to come to blows, so I intervened. I said something like, "Listen, you're both prominent in your fields, both interested in the truth. So, let's put it to the test." "How do you test complete nonsense?" the scientist asked. I said, "Let's build a machine that tests for a completely fictional idea with the same reasonable parameters and the same approach to construction one would find in the laboratory." In truth, I expected them to laugh at me, but they agreed that it was an interesting idea, and we had nothing better to do with our time. So we started by coming up with a fictional entity. Something that is not a particle or a wave. It is the substance of empty space itself. Having negative mass, wherever there is a particle or a wave, it is pushed away. If the absolute value of its mass exceeds the absolute value of a particle's mass, the particle will be pushed away. And just to make it interesting, there is a place in the universe where the emptiness is densest, and that place is hell for all fallen particles. For this reason, we called the particle the gremlin. The scientist rolled his eyes, but also wondered if the contest was now stacked too much in his favor. The sociologist just said, "Let's get building." The scientist, of course, ended up doing most of the real work. Myself and the sociologist just did the heavy lifting. Our raw materials were the other machines in the department, machines whose destruction we could blame on the protesters outside. One time between working, in one of the rare moments we did stop to eat, my companions wanted to know why I feared the Large Hadron Collider. I explained it to them. When the collider was first being constructed, Some fears were raised that the collider might create black holes. Stephen Hawking confirmed it would, but it was nothing to worry about because they were so small. The odds of them growing large enough to do damage were billions to 1. Does that sound comforting? The odds of winning the American Mega Millions lottery are astronomical. It's amazing anybody ever wins the damn thing. Yet, people win it all the time. If there's any chance of the entire human civilization being devoured and all life on Earth dying, any chances at all, it didn't seem right to me that the decision to move forward should be made by a scientific elite. It should have been voted upon by all civilized nations. Especially, the sociologist said, when that scientific community made themselves elite with an increasingly esoteric pantheon of particles that ever more expensive and elaborate machinery is required to corroborate. Here's the $5 billion machine that says superstrings are real. Here's the $10 billion machine that says 11 dimensions, no more, no fewer, and on it goes. I'm not convinced of that yet, I said. But whether the Higgs boson is fiction or not, the effects of a black hole on Earth would be real. The black hole could turn us all into particle spaghetti. It could be a silly, backpatting machine and still the most dangerous, terrifying thing ever built on this planet. I try not to think about it. The scientist patted me on the shoulder. He knew I was going to be genuine. That the thing does scare me. I think it's to his credit he didn't try to assuage me with more statistics. Well, our machine is soon done, he said, and it will have zero chance of spawning a black hole. But it may just spawn a gremlin, the sociologist said with a grin. What would do that anyway? I asked. I should say, I like these guys, but my expertise is political philosophy. I'm an admirer of Kant, which is what brought me to Freiburg in the first place. What do you mean? The scientist asked. So I clarified. I mean, if the gremlin were somehow made real by the process of the machine, right here in this time and space, what effect would that have on physical matter? I don't know, he said. It wouldn't be good. We went over the parameters one last time before we agreed to finalize the machine. The machine would have to create a large vacuum, a vacuum as perfect as possible. A particle would then have to be projected into the center of the vacuum as quickly and with as little material interference as possible. The particle's behavior in the middle of the vacuum would then be measured for the effects of emptiness. The time of 2 tenured and 1 visiting professor to create this machine? Several thousand marks. The parts used to assemble this machine? Valued at about 50 million marks. The results the machine should produce? Priceless. Literally. Because, if the prevailing view of reality holds, the machine is a complete waste of time and resources, completely without value. Once we'd agreed, the machine was ready. We then agreed it was time to test it. The protests were still raging outside. Loud German protesting. We assembled the machine in the center of the building, so we would have some peace. The scientist entered some commands into the terminal, sat back and said, "That's it." Nothing happened, I said. It's all invisible, the sociologist said. That's the point. Only the machine ever sees this stuff. Only the machine ever can. Nobody ever sees electrons or photons. Only the machine does. Then the machine spits out some data that we then interpret to be about the things we talk about, have named, but can never see. Fascinating, isn't it? He's right about the first part, the scientist said. It's a microscopic process, so we do only have the data to go on. The data from the machine we made up? I more stated and asked. Yes, with the parameters we agreed upon. It'll keep testing. We can relax, check the data in the morning. We had been keeping closer together since working on the machine, and we were all getting on each other's nerves. Plus, it was late, and we had trouble sleeping, so we took the opportunity to each go our own way and have a little me time. I was relaxing with a new translation of Bolzano's Wissenschaftslehre when the sociologist came into my space. I wasn't ready for more of his sideways talk. To my surprise, he actually looked troubled by something. "Have you seen anybody else in here besides the 3 of us?" he asked. No, of course not. We all knew we were the only ones trapped in this particular building. It was a small one, with 1 lab and 4 lecture halls. I was resting with the lights off. Someone came into my room, asked me if I wanted to go ice fishing, and left. It must be that damned scientist. I doubt that, I said. It's a dirty trick, he said with a sigh. Very dirty. Then he left, just like that. I worried he was getting cabin fever. I went back to reading, but I kept thinking, why ice fishing? I got up and decided to go for a walk along the hallways, looking out the windows, see the torches and pitchforks. Not literally. While I was walking, I heard footsteps coming from the opposite direction. They were moving much faster than I was. The other 2 wouldn't jog to save their lives. I thought about ducking into one of the lecture halls. Then I felt stupid for even wanting to hide, so I stood my ground. Some man in all grey comes running down the hall straight toward me. I freeze. I want to duck to the side, but I can't move. I'm so startled to see anyone, let alone running at me. I just watch him coming right at me. When he gets to me, he slaps a manila envelope to my chest and keeps running. Then, I hear his footsteps stop completely. That scares me even more, because that means he stopped. Is he going to come back? I release the breath I'd been holding all that time and turn around, but I don't see him. So I go walking back the way I came. Then I keep going until I've been all the way around the building. The man had vanished. I rush to the sociologist's room to tell him someone really is in the building. When I enter, he swings a chair that misses me by inches. I shout out some string of profanity that brings him to his senses. He starts apologizing profusely. It's okay, I tell him. I saw a man running through the halls. He's probably still in here, hiding in one of the rooms. What'd he look like? He asked. Dressed in all grey, an unremarkable face, white and shaven. Didn't even make eye contact with me. What's that? In rushing in to share the news, I'd completely forgotten about the envelope. That may sound strange, but in that situation, your brain does things you wouldn't approve of. He gave me this actually. I could see he wanted to look inside. So did I. I went ahead and opened it while he turned on the light. Inside the envelope were photographs of a child sleeping. Who is that? He asked. Does it matter? This is disturbing, I said. He had no idea how disturbing, and I didn't want to make the situation volatile by saying so. You know, he said. Come on, tell me. What's the significance of ice fishing? I asked in return. Just then, we heard a god-awful scream from somewhere in the building. We exchanged frightened glances and without a word went looking for our friend. We found him alone in another lecture hall. He was sitting up like a prairie dog, like he was waiting for something. When we walked in, he barely seemed to notice us. Are you okay? I asked him. It wasn't me, he said. Well, who then? The sociologist asked. It didn't sound wholesome. It wasn't, he said. It was very unwholesome. That settles it, the sociologist said. Those protesters got in here and they're messing with us. The scientist shook his head. No protesters made that scream. What are you not telling us? I asked. The scientist seemed to relax finally. He begged us to sit down with him, and we gladly did. I don't think any of us wanted to be alone any longer. After listening carefully for a while, we brought him up to speed on what had happened to us. He listened inattentively. You want to know the significance of ice fishing? The sociologist asked. My brother and I loved ice fishing. We looked forward to it every winter. This one winter, we were goofing off a little too much, and he tripped. He tripped over my foot, went through the ice. I was trying to save him when a man we'd never seen before shows up. He says He knows exactly what to do. But all he succeeds in doing is speeding up my brother's drowning. After his failure, he left without a word. I never saw that man again in my life. It's haunted me ever since. I still have nightmares. Whoever said that to me crossed a line. A very serious line. Neither of us had heard that story before. We gave him our most deeply felt sympathy, then contemplated who would know of that and why said it to him in a time like this. How would that aid the protests at all? That brought me to the envelope. The photos in the envelope? They're of me. 30 years ago, my parents started receiving manila envelopes with Polaroids of me in various activities. He never stated what he wanted, just to terrorize them it seemed. They had the police involved. I was watched constantly. Even under surveillance, it continued. One day, it just stopped. A year later, my mom was cleaning out an apartment. Her job, after a tenant died. Inside, she found an envelope with more pictures of me. These were of me sleeping. These very pictures, taken from inside our home. She figures it was delivered to the wrong address. Either that or the dead tenant was responsible. They were placed into evidence by police. There is no way at all for them to be here. This is insane, the sociologist said. So what about the scream? I will bet it has some significance for you. No, the scientist said. It was just blood-curdling, wasn't it? They always say a scream is blood-curdling in the movies. Actually, feeling blood curdle, that swelling in our tongue and immobility in your limbs, makes it seem like an accurate description. The sociologist looked at me. I was already looking at him. Neither of us believed him, but we couldn't force him to talk about it, whatever it was. We're all educated men. We could all see the patterns. All of us were being revisited by upsetting events from our childhoods. It couldn't be a coincidence. Even if the scientist was telling the truth, two of us would be too much of a coincidence. But who would have the ability or the lack of conscience to do this? I asked. There was a pause while we thought over the possibilities. The protesters, ex-wives, the Russian government. A gremlin, the sociologist said. How does that make any sense? The scientist asked. It doesn't. It doesn't have to, the sociologist argued. We define the gremlin as a vague, empty malevolence. Who knows what a ripple effect it would have if it appeared in the midst of an already functional physical milieu. Maybe the machine worked all too well. Are you guys behind all this? The scientist asked, but he knew the answer to that before he was done speaking. We went as a group to the lab to check the data put out by the machine. The scientist looked through page after page of data. Nothing, he said. Nothing happened. The particles enter the vacuum and leave the vacuum entirely, in accordance with prevailing scientific theory. Maybe it needs calibration, I said, remembering what the sociologist had said earlier. Just turn it off, the sociologist said. Let me admit I was wrong and merely being contrarian. Please, turn it off. If I turn it off now, aren't I just admitting you're right? The scientist asked. It has no connection to these mind games. Let it run until morning, as we agreed. Here I joined in on the sociologist's side. Come on, this was just a game between the three of us. Let's not photograph the natives against their wishes, if you get me. You're being superstitious about it now? Like your Hadron Collider fears? We're leaving it run just as it is, gentlemen. If it makes you feel better, I'll stay in here with it, so I can shut it down as need be. We weren't confident enough in our concern to be prepared to physically overpower him, so we agreed to leave him where he was and went our own way. I, for one, didn't want to be near that thing. The sociologist shared that sentiment. Why do you suppose he was so adamant? He asked me. Heck if I know, I said. Being cooped up in here is getting to us all, I suppose. We camped out in the lecture hall together. He had some cigars in his pocket that he kindly shared. Sitting back in the seats, our feet up, with our cigars, we thought aloud about what was happening. "I've been thinking about something," I told him. "Let's say our crazy superstition was somehow right. Let's say a gremlin, whatever that really entails, was released and is acting on physical reality." "Yeah?" he urged. I'd lost my train of thought. I tend to do that when I run through thought processes. "Well, did it start immediately?" I continued. "Or did it reboot the world as if it had always existed?" "Interesting. What makes you wonder that? Do you remember having a tragic ice fishing memory before we built the machine?" We both puffed in silence for a while after that. It was a lot to think about. The metaphysical implications. "I do," he answered at last. "However, if I understand you right, I would only think I do. It feels like I've always had the memory. I say it's haunted me. Can I say with confidence that yesterday, when we were working on our machine, that I remember being haunted by it? No. But I feel I must have been. It's just a thought. The memory of the photos is as real to me as any other memory." That's roughly how our conversation went, before we both started to drift off into sleep, our cigars already having run their course. We were awakened by another one of those screams, this time followed by a shriek. The shriek was even more awful than the scream. The scream was madness, but the shriek was all terror. We both hurried to the lab to find our scientist friend huddled in the corner. He shrieked when we approached, so we kept our distance. The sociologist cursed under his breath and unplugged all power from the machine. While he was doing that, I kept trying to reassure our friend that we were here to help him, not to hurt him, that he had to tell us what happened so we can help him. "The scream," he said. "I know it. I heard it a long time ago. When my parents would go out and I'd be home alone, I'd hear it. This man, he'd come out of nowhere every time, stand outside my window and scream. Scream that blood-curdling scream. Did you know blood can really curdle? Fear makes it thick like gravy. He'd always be gone when police arrived. No evidence, so they and my parents thought I was lying. Every time. The last time I heard it, it was a warning. I never stayed home alone again. I always wondered who was making those screams. Who did that? I saw it today, and I can't unsee it." We took him to the lecture hall we'd been camping in and tried to get him comfortable. We didn't want to show him how absolutely terrified we ourselves were. Once the adrenaline or shock wore off, he passed out. We talked a little while he slept. We wondered if this wasn't just cabin fever, if the machine did this, was unplugging it enough? Or did we unleash a gremlin into the world forever? We could just build a new machine that de-densifies gremlins, so they're forced to the edge of the universe, one fictional machine to fix another, he said with wry humor. But it didn't seem like such a bad idea to me. "You think he did it on purpose?" he asked me. "You think he wanted to face his nightmare?" "We can ask him in the morning perhaps," I said, being half asleep by then. We went to sleep then, and it was morning when we finally woke up. Me and the sociologist, that is. The scientist was still passed out. Or so we thought. When we shook him, we felt how cold he was. Then we felt for a pulse. We couldn't find one. We wasted no time. We picked him up and hurried to the front doors. The protesters met us there as expected, to intimidate us back in. The body of our friend trumped all that. He was the first and only casualty of the protests. It was the death of the protests too. They were blamed for it. I'm not so sure they were responsible myself. I remain a skeptic.